Just told me they're and they said
Are you saving?
We have the mic.
Start again. Thank you all for coming. I'm Gracia Pellicati, and I'm a member of several of the groups that have sponsored this event tonight. A shout out to the Marblehead League of Women Voters, the Marblehead Racial Alliance, Marblehead Racial Justice Team, and the Marblehead Alliance for Democracy. And if you're interested in joining or getting more information of any of those groups, we'll have a sign-up sheet at the back of the room. So let's get started. Tonight, we're here to hear Lauren McCormack, Executive Director of the Marblehead Museum. She's going to speak to us tonight about the Jeremiah Lee Museum estate and the role of slavery in Marblehead's colonial maritime economy. But just a little bit of background. Lauren, some of you may or may not know, but she has worked in museums across Massachusetts for over 20 years. Throughout her career, her professional focus has been to study the history of diverse and marginalized communities and to use the tools museums have to offer to share their stories. So we've been lucky to have Lauren at the museum since 2018. And at the museum, she's led several projects to uncover and share the history of Black individuals who lived and worked in Marblehead throughout its history. For this work in 2023, the museum earned a Leadership in History Award from the American Association for States and Local History, which represents small museums. The museum's current major project involves research, preservation, and interpretation of the kitchen and slave quarters of the Jeremiah Lee estate, the detached brick building that dates from 1766. And you may know that Lauren will be giving another presentation, not unlike this, on Monday, June 9th, about Jeremiah Lee's brick kitchen and the slave quarters through the years. So I encourage you to keep that in your calendar and we'll be reminding you. Anyway, so here we go. Let's hand it over to Lauren. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me if I speak like this, or would you prefer the microphone? Okay. Please shout or raise your hand and wave if you can't hear me. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Gracia. Thank you to the Marblehead Racial Justice Team and all of you for coming out tonight. I know this is a very important Celtics game that we are missing, so I'll respect your time. So today what I'm going to be doing is spending a little bit of time talking about Jeremiah Lee as sort of a representative of Marblehead merchants and the Marblehead community in the late colonial period, and the role of slavery in the economic maritime economy that we had here in Marblehead. There we go. But before I get into that, I just wanted to take a minute and introduce you to the Marblehead Museum very quickly. If you're not familiar with us, we were founded in 1898 as the Marblehead Historical Society. And we own, as Gracia said, the Lee Mansion and now the brick kitchen attached to the estate, as well as the J.O.J. Foss Gallery and the museum across from the Lee Mansion, and the Grand Army of the Republic and Civil War Museum in the second floor of the old townhouse. And we have a collection of over 60,000 objects. So that's 3D objects, archival materials, photographs, you name it. And they're all available to you, the public, and researchers, genealogists. Just make an appointment, please. Be happy to show you anything. And the most important thing I think for me to mention is that the museum is a private nonprofit. We're a 501c3, which means we rely on memberships, donors, program income, but we do not receive funding, and we are not connected to the town of Marblehead. So I thought before we really dived into sort of the economics, that we would talk a little bit about how we know what we know about slavery and enslaved individuals in Marblehead. And it may or may not surprise you that it's a lot of the same resources, archival materials, documentation that we've been using as historians, as genealogists for decades, for for forever. But the difference, I think, in the last number of years is that we've been using these materials we've been studying them through a slightly different lens. We've been parsing them out slightly differently and with a different focus than we've been doing before. So for those of you who've ever done genealogy, the basic starting point is always vital records, birth, death, marriage. And the good news for us is that Colonial, Marbleheaders, and just in general, usually highlighted who was a Black person, although they would use the term, quote, Negro or mulatto or something like that. Church records, of course, and we're very lucky to have great documentation from our colonial era churches, both still existing in town and also congregational church-wise at the Congregational Library, who has taken it upon themselves to digitize all of the first and second congregational church records so they can be accessed for free online. And here on the left, you see an entry, it's a little blurry and I know you're kind of far away, but for Caesar Bourne and Phyllis Skinner, quote, Negroes. That's a marriage record. There's also tax records. What I'm showing you on the right is a tax record for Jeremiah Lee himself from 1769 through 1770. This was all self-reported, just like it is today to the IRS. And here he's listed all his property, his stores, his houses, his schooners, a cow, 3 horses, 2 hogs, and where the arrow is pointing 2 Negro boys and 1 Negro girl. And that's one of the ways we know about these enslaved individuals. Just checking that there's no issues in the audio in the chat. All right. Let's hide these. And probate records is one of the most important, I think, of the records that we use. When you passed away, there was almost always an inventory done of your goods. And if you own enslaved individuals, just like all the rest of your property, they would be included in your probate inventory. So again, I've used as an example, because it's easiest for me to grab hold of, a page from Jeremiah Lee's probate inventory. And I've highlighted for you the 3 individuals he has named in his inventory. Negro Diamond, listed as 50 pounds worth. Mm-hmm. Negro Jemmy, 40 pounds. Negro Cupid, 36 pounds. And that's listed alongside, they are listed alongside, quote, an old horse and an old chaise, a carriage of sorts. So again, you see it's property, right? People are being considered as property.
The pounds be their weight?
No, English currency before.
Pound, right, pounds, English currency of the time, because don't forget, we haven't split off from the British government yet. Newspaper advertisements, usually these come in one of 2 forms. The one on the left you see is a for sale advertisement, like we would sell a lawnmower or something to that effect. And here we have Nicholas Bartlett in 1772 putting up for sale a Negro man named Caesar, 28 years old. He well understands the shoreman's business of making fish. He's a prime chimney sweeper and he can work on a farm very well. So a multi-talented individual for sure. And on the right, we have a runaway ad, also from Marblehead, 1765. Jacob Fowle is requesting people be on the lookout for a runaway or self-emancipated slave named Ishmael. And the runaway ads are amazing because they, in the days before photographs, right, you need to really describe the person, what they were wearing, what they, if they had a lisp or if they had an accent or what languages they spoke. So it actually is a wonderful window into the humanity of these individuals who had escaped to find freedom. And census records, of course. So one of the few census records from Marblehead that it survives from before the federal government is instituted is the 1765 Essex County Census. And I've highlighted Marblehead, although I know it's hard for you to read, so I'll read it off for you. In a nutshell, there were 519 houses, 935 families, so that shows how many people are living in a house together, multiple families in one house. And there are 4,854 white people and exactly 100, quote, Negroes, 71 men and 29 women. So it's a little over 2% of the population. And before you ask, I don't know for sure. We don't know if all of these people were enslaved, if all of these people were free, or if it was some combination of both. I don't know for sure, but you'll see in another slide why I think it's most likely a combination. Military records are another great source, especially here in Marblehead, where we had such a important regiment. On the right is actually the pension record, the military pension record for Joseph Brown, our very own Joseph Brown from Gingerbread Hill. These records, newly digitized over the last 10 years, have shed so much light on these individuals. We learned so much more about Joseph. In fact, he was not a member of Glover's regiment. He was a member of a Rhode Island regiment, and he was offered his freedom if he would serve out his enslaver's son's enlistment. That's how he obtained his freedom. There's a lot more about Joseph on an article I wrote on our website, marbleheadmuseum.org, so I won't talk much more about him today. But on the left is one of Jeremiah Lee's enslaved individuals, Diamond. He appears once in a ledger book for John Glover's regiment, and ironically, on July 4th, 1776. And of course, there's a myriad of maritime documents, especially coming out of a place like Marblehead, and oftentimes crew lists, seamen's protection certificates, those type of documents would classify the race of an individual. And many more, of course. Now, how many enslaved people were there in Marblehead? Well, it's a little bit hard to answer, but the best way I can try to answer it for you is through tax records. These are records that I have almost more recently uncovered that have been newly digitized, so I haven't had a chance to work my way through all of the data we can get from them. But what I did do was go through and quantify the number of enslaved people listed. Now, as you can see, they're from the 1740s and the 1770s, so there's a lot of years that are missing. And the other thing about tax records that I know is a fact because I've found discrepancies is that just like sometimes today, people sometimes don't tell the whole truth on their taxes, shall we say. They may forget to list, you know, a boat they had or a piece of property they had or an enslaved person they had because they didn't want to pay the taxes on them. But here's what we do have. So in the 1740s seems to be the peak of the quantity, the number of enslaved people here in Marblehead between 31 and 52. And that's about 2 to 3% of the population of that time. The numbers start to dwindle a bit more when we get into the 1770s, and it's actually not surprising because we are already seeing in general in the tax records of the 1770s, the wealth of the town start to decrease. And that's to do with the troubles with the British government, with the Crown and with Parliament, the boycotts, the non-importation agreements, the ships coming into harbors and things like the British ships coming into the harbors and things like that. But to get a sense of it. Oh, and here's that census again, but we sort of talked about that, so I'll skip by it. And this is all being recorded and will be available on the museum's YouTube page, among other places. So if you want to go back and see something closer up, for those of you in the room, or you needed more time with something, you'll be able to see it after the fact. So who were the enslaved people in Marblehead? The most important thing I think to take away from all of this is that they were not a homogeneous group. They were human beings. They were diverse human beings in their own ways, just like everybody in this room is. We all are our own person. There were adult men, they were adult women. There were also children. Here on the top right, you see an ad for 2 enslaved men, or males, being sold by the estate of John Palmer after his death. A quote, likely Negro man about 25 years old, and a quote, fine Negro boy about 14. And we certainly have evidence for younger than that. And if you were born to an enslaved mother, you are an enslaved individual in this time period anyway. So there are babies, there are middle-aged people, there are older adults as well. And we may think that we're all directly come from Africa, and that may have been true a little bit earlier on, but by the time we get into the 18th century, and certainly the mid to late 18th century, in Marblehead, in the Northeast in particular, a lot of the people are no longer being brought here directly from Marblehead that would have been living here. At this point, they might be coming from the West Indies, the Caribbean islands. That's sort of a halfway point. Not to say that they were brought there from Africa and then immediately brought to the New England colonies. They certainly may have been a couple of generations in the West Indies before coming to the New England colonies. For instance, Lucretia Brown, Joseph Brown's wife, Lucretia Thomas Brown, again, of Gingerbread Hill and Joe Frogger fame. Her father was Peter Thomas. And as this record shows to us, he was born in Jamaica. And likely from what I can tell from other documents, he was born enslaved. So likely he was born in the West Indies and eventually brought as an enslaved person to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And then of course, we also see people who are born here in the colony or in other neighboring colonies. One thing that has shocked a lot of us who are doing this research is how mobile these individuals, these enslaved individuals were in this time period. Now, some of that was a forced mobility as a lady's maid or a manservant or a carriage driver. They were forced to travel for their enslaver's business or visiting or going to stay with family. But there's definitely this sense of mobility because oftentimes enslaved people are marrying enslaved people from other towns. People in Marblehead marrying in Danvers, people in Marblehead marrying other people from Ipswich. So you're seeing this sort of, how else are they meeting each other? There's some sort of mobility, whether forced or in part of their own volition. What do these individuals do? Or what, I should say, what were they forced to do? Enslaved people in Marblehead or Massachusetts, as opposed to the plantations of the South or the West Indies, were often had multiple roles and in the household or their enslaver's business. And unlike the white people, they don't seem to have been defined by gender in the same way. We think of cooking as a woman's job in this time period, and that's true for white women and white girls. But oftentimes, enslaved men were cooks, or enslaved women did farming. So we don't have the same strict gender roles here. There was skilled labor and there was unskilled laborers as well. So for instance, domestic enslaved individuals in a domestic setting may have been cooks, lady's maid, manservant, coachman, gardener, cleaner. They might have helped out with the children. They may have done all of the above or some of the above. Obviously, a man is not a lady's maid and a lady is not a manservant, but you get my point. And how they were part of the economy is certainly even clearer in their role in the maritime industries in a town like Marblehead. We see them as sailors on board ships. There was a Trevitt, and Pompey Trevitt was on board of a ship in the early 18th century. He tried to escape but was caught. Ashley Bowen, the diarist and the ship's rigger in Marblehead, he hired from an enslaver to two enslavers, two different individuals, Cato Watts and Caesar Holman, to work on preparing ships to go out to sea. And they certainly served other purposes to do with the maritime industry. Caulking, stevedores, laborers, basically. They worked in the warehouses. We have evidence of one helping a baker, an innkeeper who had an enslaved person who would have been forced to help run the day-to-day of the inn. And then soldiers. Touched on that a little bit with Joseph Brown and Diamond Lee. Oftentimes, these were people who were forced to serve, like Joseph Brown was, or like Romeo Johano, I'm not sure if I'm saying the last name correctly, but his enslaver was Gabriel, and Gabriel was an officer in John Glover's regiment. And Romeo was forced to be his servant and go to war with him, basically. who were the enslavers here in Marblehead? Well, the clergy, for one. A lot of clergy members in Marblehead in the late 17th and 18th centuries were enslavers. Here on your right is Peter Bors of St. Michael's Church. The story with him is he had an enslaved woman who assaulted him, or so he claimed at least, and he was so vexed that he had determined that he must sell her, which he did. And the story is that he used the money to pay for this portrait to be done of him, which is now in the Harvard Art Museum. Here on the left are records from the Second Congregational Church, which is now the UU Church on Montfort Street. And here Reverend Holyoke records the baptism of, there's an arrow next to it, Chester, a Negro man of mine own, son of Chester and Judith, whom I believe he also enslaved Chester and Judith. A number of merchants, just like Lee. These are just a few examples that I've gleaned from probate records of merchants. And they're the names that we all recognize, right? Fowle, Lee, Glover, Skinner, Orne, Gary, Devereaux, Sweat, and others. These are some other occupations and the standings of people who were enslavers. Deacon, yeoman, innholder, I mentioned, cabinet maker, so furniture maker, ship's captain, and widows. Oftentimes they would inherit from their husbands. When the husbands passed away and they were widows, they would inherit enslaved individuals, or at least the right to the labor of the enslaved individual until they, say, remarried, just like the rest of their property that they were allowed to have until they remarried. So I want to talk for a minute about the colonial Marblehead slave trade and what that looked like. Because I think we have a picture in our minds, rightfully so, of what the slave trade was in the colonial era. And that is a ship, a large ship that is outfitted with the sole purpose, right, of carrying as many enslaved or purchased Africans from Africa to wherever they're being sold, right? That's happening, obviously, in this time period. Newport is a really important, that's probably not the right way to say it, but a large slave trading port in New England in the colonial period. But that's not what we're seeing in Marblehead. In Marblehead, from what I've found in the colonial period now, so I'm talking about particularly the mid to late 18th century until the Revolutionary War, what I've been seeing is more of, for lack of a better term, an ad hoc slave trade. In other words, having one or two individuals put on board a ship that has a cargo of many things. It could be rum, cod, timber, and one or two individuals. There is online a slave trade database. There's a transatlantic and an intra-Atlantic coastal slave trade database. And the only Marbleheader that's on it, this is constantly being added to, but the only Marbleheader currently on it is Jeremiah Lee. Because in the 1760s, his ship, the Derby, that he owned, was sent to the Upper James River in Virginia with 2 enslaved individuals on board. Only one disembarked in the Upper James River area. I don't know what happened to the other one. Died, escaped, I don't know. There's also another interesting note or mention in Ashley Bowen's journal. If you're not familiar with Ashley Bowen's journal, he was a ship's rigger. He was many things in town, but his journals have survived from the 1750s through the 1770s, and they are so important to understanding Marblehead at that time period. And he writes a lot about Lee because he worked quite a bit for Jeremiah Lee. And here we have in an entry from 1764, and I'm going to quote, "I assisted in fixing rigging for Colonel Jeremiah Lee, brig Africa, a Guineaman." Now, I've worked in maritime and maritime adjacent museums, if you will, for quite a long time. And I kind of thought I knew what that meant, Guineaman, but I wanted to double check. So I did what historians tend to do, is I went to the Oxford English Dictionary. So if you want to know what a word meant at a certain time period, that is the place to go. And according to the Oxford English Dictionary, in the time period we're speaking about, a Guineaman is a vessel trading to the coast of Guinea, hence a slave ship. And it's named Africa. So I have not found other evidence of the Africa in the time period that I've been able to see through Ashley Bowen of it going directly to Africa. But at some point, whether for Lee or for somebody before him, it likely did at least make one or some voyages to traffic human beings from Africa. And Lee is certainly not the only one. I make these arguments because I see it in other sources, in Samuel White, in the Pedricks, the Hoopers, that this sort of idea of trading one or two individuals on a voyage. Here is a letter for a voyage of a Samuel White-owned ship, another merchant in town. And at the top, he's talking about the amount of rum that's on board for different people's rum that's to be sold. And then he writes, quote, Mr. Lewis also sends by you his Negro boy, which he desires you get sold for him, for you most he'll fetch, and invest ye net proceeds in flour, F-L-O-U-R, so commodity. So trade a commodity and buy a commodity. So that's what we're seeing here. So now on to the transatlantic economy and where Marblehead sort of sat in all of that. You've heard of the triangle trade?
Yeah.
You're familiar with that? Very, very, very briefly. It's Africans are purchased in Africa to be sold to the Americas. They work to produce sugar, tobacco, and cotton sold to Europe, and then goods are brought back down to Africa, and this cycle continues. So you might say to yourself, okay, well, we're not producing in Marblehead sugar, tobacco, or cotton. And as I mentioned before, except for maybe one or two exceptions perhaps, we're not seeing a wholesale trade of individuals coming directly from Africa to Marblehead. So that's not our economy. But this is a very simplified and very specific economic action that's taking place in the colonial period. So I want to complicate it a little bit because the economy that Marblehead's involved in is more complicated, certainly, than the triangle trade that we're seeing here, that we think of as the colonial transatlantic economy. So I found this map on National Geographic. It's a little more complex, and we can start to see Marblehead in this. I know you're far away, and it's probably not that easy to see, but we can see Marblehead a little bit in, for instance, the purple line that includes fish going from the 13 British colonies down to the West Indies. You've probably, those of you who've been in Marblehead for a while have heard about how the fish were caught from the Grand Banks, cured here on Marblehead, and then the Marblehead vessels brought the lesser quality fish to the plantations in the West Indies. That was bought up by enslavers to feed their enslaved people, because keep in mind, in the West Indies, the cash crop, it's so valuable that it doesn't make sense for enslavers to use their enslaved people to do anything but grow and prep the cash crop, right? So they want to buy food from somebody else. And then you're also seeing similarly some of the fish going to, well, here it's going to Great Britain. For us, it was oftentimes going to Spain or Portugal, the better quality fish, and was bought up there. And then you see other things going back and forth. So we're getting a bit more to the complexity of what Marblehead was involved in. Let's take it a little bit further, because I'm missing a few things here that I see Marblehead merchants doing. Not just Lee, of course, but Lee as well. They're going up to Maine. They're going up to Nova Scotia for timber. Because we're basically getting deforested here, but they're also getting deforested, or they are deforested, in the West Indies, where the plantations are. And so they need wood for housing for their enslaved people and for the white people as well. But they need a lot of wood, especially on sugar plantations, to process sugar and turn it into things like molasses, for instance. So they need wood. So Jeremiah Lee and Marblehead merchants are going up, they're getting wood, and they're bringing it down here, but they're also bringing it down to the West Indies, among other places. What we're missing here in this map, at least, are all those goods that are coming from Europe. So we're selling fish and we're selling other items that we have, and we're getting back from Europe lemons, capers, oil, salt, luxury items. But we're also missing the coastal trading that was being done up and down the colonies. So Marbleheaders were going down to the mid-Atlantic and to the south, to the colonies down there, and getting slave-produced goods. We'll see that a little bit more in another slide I'll show you, but I'm talking about rice, cotton, tobacco. They're trading, again, fish, timber, rum. They're bringing cloth back up and it's being turned, or excuse me, like cotton back up and it's being turned into cloth. So this is a complex economy of ships and goods going all over, kind of more like this. I was gonna try to do this myself, but I have no ability to design anything. So I sort of grabbed this just as a way to show you a bit of the complexity of it all. Oh, so the other thing about Ashley Bowen, it's very helpful, is that he recorded, because he was so actively involved in the shipping industry out of Marblehead, he recorded when ships went out of the harbor and who owned them. Or if not that, who was the captain, but oftentimes who owned them. And then when they came back in from their voyages, he recorded where they had just come from, their last port before they came back. Very helpful. So you could do this with all of the merchants that he talks about in Ashley Bowen's journals, which are also online actually. But I just did this for Lee. So I was trying to figure out where his ships were going and where his ships were coming back from. And in a nutshell, not surprising, the majority of Lee's ships are going to, sailing from here to Spain and the West Indies, but also South Carolina, Maryland, Portugal, Europe, blanket term, even a whaling voyage thrown in there for good measure. And they're coming back, excuse me, also Spain, the West Indies, Virginia, Maryland, Portugal, England, Europe, and the whaling thrown in there for good measure. But as I think what I've sort of already kind of hinted at is they're not really oftentimes just going from Marblehead to Spain and then back to Marblehead. There's a lot of other places they're stopping at along the way. This is just the two of them side by side. So quickly, a case study of this and the complexity of this are from the Tucker Papers, which are Captain Tucker, who made his name perhaps in the Revolutionary War, you might say, but he had already been working for Lee for quite a while. Harvard University owns these, and there's two letters, and they really speak to what these ships, where these ships were going. And in a nutshell, what you can't see here, but in a nutshell, in the two letters is, for example, Lee says to Captain Tucker, okay, take the ship, go down to the Carolinas, get the rice. Take the rice up to Nova Scotia, get the timber. Take the timber over to Europe, or to the West Indies, excuse me, and then make sure you go to Europe, get rid of the fish you have on board, and pick me up, what is it, salt. And if you can't find salt there, fill your ship with freight, go somewhere else that might have salt, like Cadiz. Then when you're at Cadiz, either unload the freight and add salt or just add salt and then come back. So a lot of it is at the discretion of the captain to do the best thing he can with what he's got for Lee to make the most money. And then there, of course, there are what they called factors at all of these ports throughout Europe and the West Indies and even down south, where he knew these people and they would do what was best for him, either telling the captain where to sell to get the best price or telling the captain where to go to get the cheapest salt or the cheapest whatever. But it's complicated. And I'm using Lee as an example because I have the most information about him. But just to show you, other merchants are doing the exact same thing. This is a map and list compiled by one of our volunteers who's been working on the Samuel White Papers from 1770 to 1775. His ships are going to pretty much the same places Lee's are going to. They're going to Spain, they're going to Portugal, they're going to the West Indies, England, Virginia and Maryland, Nova Scotia, and he has also the Netherlands. So it's not just Lee, that's what the merchants of Marblehead are doing at this time. They're all involved in this economy, transatlantic economy, that is doing a couple things. In part, it is trading goods that are produced by the labor of enslaved people, or in part, providing plantation owners, enslavers, with the goods they need to support slavery. What I mean by that, food, clothing for enslaved people, items needed for shelter for enslaved people, other goods needed to support that system. We can look at it in another way. And that is from what are the trade goods that, for instance, Lee in this scenario has in his warehouses here in Marblehead. So when Lee dies in May of 1775, we just passed the 250th anniversary of his death on May 10th. They do an inventory of all of his worldly goods, his real estate, his personal estate, including his warehouses and storehouses, and even what's on some of the cargoes of some of his ships that are still at anchor. And I took a list of all of those and I broke them up into categories. And then I looked across this list and I tried to find what were the items that were produced by enslaved people, enslaved labor. And then on the other hand, what were the items that he had that were, at least as a conservative estimate, the types of things that would be sold to support the system of slavery. And I came up with these. I'm not making a case that this is the entirety of anybody's trade, but it's an important portion of the trade. So we have fish, that's the codfish, right? That we talked about. Flour in the mid-Atlantic at this time is sometimes being produced by enslaved labor. Sugar, that's turned into molasses, rice, of course. Cloth. In this time period, the equivalent of Negro cloth is Osnabrück. Now, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, so Osnabrück, whatever, it doesn't matter. That's the sort of harsh, sort of rough cloth that would be used, especially on plantations, for what they would call Negro cloth, so that the laborers would wear. You might not see it so much in Marblehead. Marblehead, you might see sort of a regular cotton fabric or something like that on an enslaved person, just as you would on a lower middling class individual. Even on Mrs. Lee on some of her not nice days might wear a cotton dress or something. And there's some of these other cloths could also been part of that, but I was trying to be a bit conservative with all of this. And then of course, in the other goods, there's the tobacco. So who's benefiting from all this? I think it's pretty straightforward to say that Lee and the merchants that are involved in this trade are benefiting. I don't know that anybody will argue with that. Because they own the ships, right? And it's their credit that's buying up things. They own the fish flakes where the fish are curing. You know, they own all that. They are controlling all that. But Lee and White and Pedrick and Hooper, they do not sail the ships. They do not captain the ships. They do not prepare the ships to sail. They do not repair the ships. They don't even provide necessarily the supplies for the ships. So you have a whole other portion of the town's economy that doesn't make money if these ships are not going out and being part of this trade. So I hesitate to use the term trickle-down effect, because that's a way to determine that, and I'm not an economist, so I might even be using that term wrong. But my point is that the merchants have the money, but they are supporting the livelihoods of all of these other types of occupations, if you will. Now, and if these people are being paid and the merchants are being successful in their trade, then you start to see other people who are benefiting in Marblehead. Because now these people can spend more money, or credit, as the case may be at that time, on food or luxury items, supplies, the houses that we see being built. In Marblehead, for a time, there's a clockmaker. you don't have a clockmaker in a town when you can't support that clockmaker and he can't make a living. So there's got to be enough people who can support that. The cabinet makers are making furniture because people can afford it. So my point is that I would argue that almost everybody in Marblehead at this point in time is benefiting from this transatlantic slave economy or slave-based economy. So I want to be respectful of time and also provide opportunity for some questions. But before I do that, I would like to say that there are opportunities for you all to dig into this further. Our website is one place to start, marbleheadmuseum.org. We spent a lot of time trying to write up small blog posts about related facts about the history of Black and Indigenous and people of color. So like Joseph and Lucretia Brown, like other things that might be of interest, like the ship Desire, which was the first ship, one of the first ships built in this area that also happened to be the first ship to bring people, enslaved Africans, to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, for instance. We also have an online database that we're still working on. We will be building it. We've found over 200 names of individuals who were enslaved here in Marblehead. And we are working on biographies as much as we can for each of those people. It's a slow process, so bear with us, but you can go to our website and see some of their stories. So it's not just names and dates, it's stories of individuals, as you can see here, including links whenever possible to their the primary sources where we're finding all of this from. And there are signs that we put around town in part thanks to the Marblehead Racial Justice Team support, as well as Essex Heritage support. Joseph and Lucretia Brown, the ship Desire, I mentioned the Nomkeg people. Sorry, the Agnes one is not actually up, but there's one at the Negro, quote, Negro burying place, which is now at the Gun House on Elm Street. And of course, we've been doing this work in part because when we finally finished renovating the brick kitchen and slave quarters, which is almost done, I promise, the goal is that the first floor will be an exhibit, and the inaugural exhibit, semi-permanent exhibit, will be about the enslaved people of Marblehead and their experiences in Marblehead. And so we have been working on this for quite some time. We received a National Endowment for the Humanities Planning Grant and a Massachusetts Humanities Expanding Massachusetts Stories Grant in 2020, both in 2023 that carried over into 2024 to start to plan this exhibit. So we have an artifact list, we have schematic designs that you see here to tell these stories. Unfortunately, you probably all know what's been happening with NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities. And so we are no longer confident in the second part of the grant. In fact, we finally received word late last week that we will not be receiving a grant from National Endowment for the Humanities to finish this project. So ongoing efforts to fundraise to make this happen, because both the staff and the board are committed to continuing to tell these stories. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Marblehead Rev 250 group. As part of our commemorations for the anniversary of the Revolutionary War, we want to make sure we're also incorporating inclusive stories and the diversity of Marblehead's regiments, soldiers, and the home front as well. So that is that. And I'd be happy to answer questions or have a conversation. If anybody's on Zoom that has a question, as soon as I can get back to you, please put it in the chat. Oh, sorry, in the back, yeah.
Just curious if there was much difference in the way slaves were treated here in Marblehead versus how slaves were treated on plantations or in the southern states.
It's an interesting question. I think I'm gonna actually start by saying, no matter what, these people were enslaved, which meant they had no control over
Mhm.
their lives. Now, with that being said, were their experiences different? In some ways, because their day-to-day life, the jobs they were made to do were different. But that was true even within Marblehead. So if you are an enslaved person living in the garret of your enslaver's home, there's a different level of surveillance than if you are in the detached slave quarters. And I'm not saying one's better or one's worse, but it's a different experience. And so when I first started, some people would say, well, people were nicer to their enslaved people here.
Sorry.
They were enslaved, right? And I know you know this, I'm not telling you this, like pointing to you, but
I have
just in general.
They did have some legal rights that slaves in the South didn't have. They could sue, and they got their freedom in a lot of cases through legal action.
They were also able to, their word could be taken in court, unlike in other, well, what are now states at that point, provinces. But of course, they couldn't sue for their freedom until slavery became illegal in the state of Massachusetts, which it was put into the state constitution in 1780. But it wasn't until a couple of court cases, Buck Walker being one, but maybe even more important, the Ma Vet case. The Elizabeth Freeman case in 1783, but you still had to know about the fact that you could sue, and you had to be able to find somebody to take your case. We definitely have evidence. You can even see it in the census records. There's a fair number of Black individuals still living in white households long past 1783. Now, whether that was because they were coerced or they didn't know they could sue for their freedom, there's so many possibilities. Maybe they didn't have any place else to go. We don't know.
It was a different relationship though, because of this proximity of the owners.
Repeat the question.
The question was the experience versus in Marblehead or New England versus in, say, the South for an enslaved individual. Sorry. Oh, what he just said?
No.
Can you repeat?
Yeah, they're living under the same roof. There's a proximity. It's different than being in slave quarters out in the back someplace in a plantation, much different. Yeah, part of the family in a way.
I don't know.
Well, more surveillance, put it that way.
There's more surveillance when you're in the house or right on the smallest property. Right,
Yeah.
then if you're able to go to far detached slave quarters that you might find at a plantation. But even in Monticello, the slave quarters are in view of the house. So it really depends on your situation and exactly where you were and who you were around and all of that. Sir, in the back?
Yeah, so your reference to Ashley Bowen
Yes.
and his reference to the Lee ship that was a Guineaman, seems to infer that, okay, this is a big ship equipped for mass human trade. But it doesn't sound like your research indicates that that was a regular course of events for this ship or for Lee's, merchant undertaking.
So the question is about the Brig Africa so Brig is a larger ship.
Well, and I also, sorry, just to follow on.
Yep.
It doesn't sound like there, and I'm not trying to make equivalencies here or anything else. I'm just trying to understand.
Yep.
In a place like Providence, Moses Brown was shipping, going to Africa, getting cargo and bringing it back on a regular basis. Doesn't sound from what you said like that was what was happening here. It was more incidental than.
Right, I don't have evidence that it was the way it was in Newport or with the Browns. It's another good example out of Providence. I know, but what I'm saying is that they were trafficking individuals.
Absolutely.
Sort of, I hate to put it this way, but as the need arose, if somebody wanted to sell somebody and you were going somewhere, they would, put that enslaved person on your vessel and instruct you as they did with Samuel White's document to get the best price you could at the right place. And there's other documents like that in our collection alone from Marblehead. Here's Caesar, get a good price for him, wherever it makes sense to sell him, that type of thing.
I was gonna comment on that. I was thinking like up here in the north, let's just say Marblehead or in the northeast, we didn't have the plantations like they had in the south.
Not in Marblehead, no.
But, in my recent reading of the Frederick Douglass autobiographies, he had lived in Maryland, and he got a chance to go to the master's home, right? But you know what? He always had to think about getting sent back to the plantation. I mean, that's different than somebody who's a house servant up here. They didn't think about having to go to the plantation. If they said anything against those masters in the South, they had all kinds of consequences, from being sold to
Being just.
Yeah, and but what I would say is that, slavery is based on, at some level, fear,
Mhm.
right? The way that the slave system works is that there's a fear that something will happen to you. You could be beaten. You could be assaulted. You could be sold. You could be loaned out. We know that Chance Bradstreet was loaned out for money, though, if I'm remembering correctly. Lou, correct me if I'm wrong. So I guess loaned is not the right term, but
Rented.
rented, thank you. Leased out, thank you, yeah. Leased out for a number of years. So there's a fear that you are going to be taken from, sold, rented out. When the Roby family leaves Marblehead because they're loyalists, they take Flora Lee's daughter with them, but they don't take Flora Lee for years. So there's always a fear of something happening that you can't control. So in a way, I don't know that it was that much different.
I think there's a very difference of, I understand what you're saying, but I think the reality is that there was a difference, because you feared that overseer. Okay, they had just terrible reputations, and the slaves knew it. Even the masters were very crafty. Most of the slaves never knew or met the master. But it wasn't uncommon that, the master would pass a slave on the road as they were heading back or something, and they might stop them and say, "Who is your master?" and quiz them, and then, they give the wrong answer and they're sold the next week.
I guess the only follow-up I would have is that I don't know that we see this. That could have happened here. The thing that I've been interested in as I look about the mansion and the slave quarters and how close they are is this idea of surveillance. And it's right on the road too, right? So these people are property. So every white person that walks by that Jeremiah Lee estate or wherever, they're surveilling as well. They might not have direct control over what happens to you if you're not working or you're doing something they don't like. But there's always this element of surveillance that's happening. And that's just what we read in some of the books that are published about this. Jared Ross Hardesty is probably one of the best newer authors who really talks about that. Wendy Warren talks about that in her book as well.
Maybe on the note of like the culture of the town, but also you said that there's probably some Black or Negro at the time people were enslaved and others were free. Do you have you come across anything as to how that affected how people in this small village interacted in the course of the day? If you were some of the forced jobs, you could be in transactions with all kinds of people, and what was the custom of the town of free Blacks maybe dealing with enslaved Blacks or white people that were doing the same job as an enslaved person? Like, how did people relate to each other?
It's so hard to say in so many ways, right? Like Cato Watts and Caesar Holman, who are being hired out to work with Ashley Bowen, probably alongside other white people, perhaps. He doesn't comment on that, and they don't leave a written record. It's hard to say. There is one court case that actually Becky, who's here, has uncovered, which is that of Reuben Kittredge in the late 60s, 1760s, in Nathan Bowen's court records, that Reuben was a free man, a free Black man, And he was, at night, he was allowing is not the right word, there were gatherings in his home that, of enslaved people. We know they were enslaved because Reuben is brought to court because he's allowing these gatherings to take place that include enslaved people without their quote master's permission. So I do think there's bound to be, and we see it in the
Can you
marriage.
just- On that court case?
Yep.
Was, like, I don't know if this is correct, who sued him? Who
It
was like,
It was,
I'm mad at you, what are you doing?
nobody turned him in. It was
No,
against the law.
it didn't really say who made the complaint. Nathan Bowen brought it saying there were complaints from the masters that.
But it may have been that
was
I-
entertaining these people's enslaved persons.
It's almost that idea of surveillance, right? Somebody's noticing this, and they find out there's not permission being given for this. There's also a curfew that's put into place in the 1730s. Anybody who's a Negro or mulatto enslaved or slave is not allowed out after 9, which implies that it's happening. It also has something to do with the smallpox that's happening, but it also implies that it's happening because you don't pass laws if it's not happening. But the one thing that's been so fascinating in this research is you can see that there are communities being formed. There's relationships among Black individuals that are being formed. So despite everything, right, it's sort of human nature, right, to form friendships, to build relationships, to get married, to have children. Even if, like, Pompey Hooper is not living in the same household as Flora Lee, even after they marry, they're not allowed because they are owned by 2 different people. But they've still developed a relationship and they get married and they have a child.
One of the books that I read about the Salem witch trials said that the original accusation focused on a woman named Tituba, who was an enslaved person. And from that, I wonder, do we know much about Afro-Caribbean religions in Marblehead or Salem or wherever?
That's a very good question. We have been trying, a bunch of us working on this exhibit have been trying to find something. We had that sort of speaks to this sort of African or even West Indian adoption and maintenance of cultural traditions. Other historians in other locations have found evidence of that. Probably one of the clearest is the Nikesi bundle, which is a bundle of spiritual items that were found in the house. Oh, I forget the name of the house, in Newport, Rhode Island. It's sort of evidence of the continuation of individuals' cultural heritage, spiritual cultural heritage. Other scholars from other parts, not just New England, have found certainly foodways that persist, that can harken back to West Indian or African cultural heritage. I have not found anything in particular about Marblehead yet. I'm hoping someday I do see something, or that the archaeologists that are coming back again this year for the final time at the Lee Mansion, May 27th through the end of June, will find something that sort of speaks to that. Like at the Shirley Eustace house, they found a cowrie shell that they are working on figuring out whether or not it's linked to West African spiritual belief systems, which they believe it might be. Like finding something like that would be amazing, but we have not yet run into anything like that, unfortunately. Judy.
Solid information you all are coming up with, which is so valuable for the context of this town. And hearing some of the questions and comment, the town, I think, to put this, as we're hearing all this, I think it's important to remember how densely populated Marblehead was, as you pointed out. How crowded these houses were, how crowded the streets were, how small the footprint of the town was, and yet it was the 6th most populous metropolis in British North America. If not the 6th, it's probably the 6th, maybe the 10th, but somewhere in there, it's a pretty large size population. And I think it's an interesting comparison to Boston and Salem, which are equally dense. Boston and Marblehead Marblehead and Salem are pretty similar in size. Marblehead has about 750 more people, men, women, children, than Salem does. But per household in Marblehead, it's about 2.5 Black people, if that 100 figure is correct, about 2.5 Black people per family in Marblehead. In Salem, it's about 5 Black people. There's one Black person for every 2.5 families. I take that back. In Salem, it's 1 Black person for every 5 families. Sorry, I'm still not saying this right. Let me back up. In Marblehead, it's 1 Black person for every 9 families. In Salem, it's 1 Black person for every 5 families. In Boston, it's 1 Black person for every 2.5 families. So there's a much denser population or concentration and proportion of enslaved people in Boston, and then half as much in Salem, and then less in Marblehead. And a lot of that is because there are a lot of poor white guys who are working for cheap because they've retired from the sea. I think that's an important concept, that there are a lot of laborers here who you can hire, white laborers who you can hire for very inexpensive money. But I think we have to remember, this is a metropolis, this town that you've been talking about. And I think that changes the perspective on it a little bit. Yeah, a lot of people, not a village.
Two quick questions. Can you share with us what is the amount of grant that has been canceled?
Well, canceled is not quite the right word. We were not awarded the grant. We never did a chance. It was 380,000. But we're gonna do it for a lot cheaper than that, thanks to many people who are now donating their time. It will happen. And it will still look good.
The next question is, do you want to put in a plug for docents or
I'm happy to. So we're constantly doing this research, right? We need to do a lot more research. So if you're interested in research on this or other topics, please do come chat with me or email me. My email is on our website in the About section. And of course, we are always looking for docents for the Jeremiah Lee Mansion that will open on June 1st. And there was someone on my hand before I let you all go.
Yep. Yes, and the advertisements that you showed, what does the word likely mean? A
Oh,
likely slave or runaway slave?
good, like good, like,
Yeah,
like good.
good.
Yeah.
Okay,
Good.
a good slave?
Yeah,
Likeable.
Desirable.
desirable, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Mike, as far as thank you very much. Well, thank you all. I don't want to keep you any longer. I'm happy to. Cindy, go ahead. I can hear you.
Can you hear?